Hello, welcome to Wheat from the Chaff on the Farmgate podcast channel. I'm ffinlo Costain, the chief editor of 8.9.com.
And I'm Joe Stanley, head of sustainable farming at the Allerton Project.
And as ever, we have loads to get through. We're going to get straight on with that. But before we do, this is going out in the run up to Christmas. We've got to talk about Christmas, Joe. You've got a young family. Tell us one or two of your traditions.
Well, in the last couple of years, an elf has started appearing around our house every morning. An elf, doing sort of, quite unreasonable things. I find often unrolling toilet paper and spreading talcum powder all over the place. So that's something to wake up to every morning.
So it's almost like April Fool's Day. It's come for every day in Advent.
Every day. I mean, the kids love it. I have to clean it up.
Yeah, absolutely. We have the same thing when the kids write their letter to Father Christmas. Of course, the elves come and take it away, and they leave a bit of a mess because obviously they've come through the fireplace to get them. And recently, it seems, just in the last few years, because we've been using the log fire more, the letters when they come back from Father Christmas are always massively singed along the sides. Sometimes you almost can't read it down one or two of the edges. But
there's ashes everwe're isn't there?
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah, but we did get one or two footprints. We had footprints in the ashes this morning because we're recording this, although this is going out just in the run up to Christmas. We're recording this on the first day of Advent, so that's the 1st of December. And my kids actually managed to get their Father Christmas letters out and sent before the last week run up to Christmas this time. And I have to say, when the elves came this morning or came overnight, they left footprints in the ashes, which kids loved.
Well, as my kids' letters went over the weekend, we went to visit Santa, which was good of him to come all the way to England and handed them to him personally. So hopefully right at the top of the sack.
Well, there we go. I wonder what the policymakers within the farming world might like from Father Christmas this year. See, that was a seamless segue, wasn't it? Beautiful. Do you think they might like, a whole bundle of inheritance tax?
Yes, if Santa could deliver reasonable fact-based policy making, that would be very welcome. So obviously, as you say, Ffinlo, we're recording this at the very start of December, so the budget was only a few days ago. And to sadly nobody's surprise, we found that Rachel Reeves decided not to make any significant move whatsoever on last year's imposition of inheritance tax on farmland. Now, we're not going to go back into that as a topic, but really just to say that it's crazy the number of backslides and U-turns and listening to groups, including people like non-doms around taxation, that the government has been very willing to do over the last year. And yet on this inheritance tax issue on farmland, they have been absolutely steady. And even with regard to the increasing amount of lobbying we're seeing and concern from rural Labour MPs, some 35 of whom the National Farmers Union now is essentially has on board in terms of publicly now saying that this is a damaging policy. Just hugely disappointing to see a total the absolute intransigence from government on this issue, especially in light of all of the positive noises and support that government had voiced whilst in opposition. The Labour Party had voiced whilst in opposition, and again, without going into the detail, it will continue to have an absolutely frosting effect on all the things we should be talking about in terms of the countryside, in terms of investment, in terms of growth, in terms of nature-friendly farming, the focus on regenerative agriculture. Sadly, all of the oxygen continues to be taken up on the inheritance tax issue.
Yeah, and as you say, it's clearly a problem for those individual farmers that are going to be hit by it. I think there are a few things that I'd like to say on it. The first is that there was a story that we ran, and of course it's worth mentioning that a lot of the stories that we're going to be talking about on the programme today are linked to news items on 8.9.com. So if you've not yet had a chance to look there, please do go and have a look. And we had a headline which actually came out from NFU Mutual saying that almost half of farms do not yet have a succession plan in place. And when this issue has been such a hot topic for the last year, it seems incredible to me that there are still half of farms that have either just been so complacent that they haven't thought about it, or else have been and challenge me on this, have been so convinced that the NFU is going to be successful. They thought it's not been worth the effort at this stage. And it does seem to me like the NFU has put so much energy into campaigning on this issue, when actually it should have been putting a comparable amount of energy into informing people about how they can manage or indeed avoid the tax through succession planning, and just to talk about what succession planning is and the process of it.
There's certainly no shortage of that going on, Finlay. So, again, I'm a county chairman for the NFU, and we've been organising at county level, certainly, events where, we're informing members about how to plan for this, knowing that it is going to come in. And of course, all the other political parties have pledged to rescind this policy at the next election. We'll see whether that happens or not. Of course, you can't, guarantee these things. But you're right, Finlay. Look. Still, according to this data from NFU Mutual, a huge number of farmers have failed to plan at all for any sort of succession, let alone a succession that involves the swinging taxation associated with this new IHT policy. Now, there's going to be a whole range of reasons for that, from head in the sand thinking to, as you say, oh, this must get overturned. To frankly looking at the economics of putting those plans in place. And, there are many businesses now who are spending 4 and 5 figure sums on future proofing, on planning, on legal advice. And, this is money which in most cases doesn't exist. And I suppose many people will be reticent to spend that. But also there is another thing which is worth mentioning, frankly. And again, I can think of personal examples whereby, look, there will be a certain strain of family farm where, frankly, perhaps this just isn't of interest, where, we always presume that all farms are always thinking of how to pass things on to the next generation, and thinking of the land as that kind of collegiate asset. But that isn't the mindset of everybody. There will be an element of, I'm all right, Jack, and the next generation can worry about that. Now, of course, that is, that's not defensible. That's not wise. That you can't legislate for that kind of incredibly flawed thinking. But nevertheless, the impact on the farm landscape, the impact on family farms and the farm, the farm landscape, the rural economy will be the same as those who find themselves unable to plan. So yeah, look, we are sadly where we are with this, which of course is the line that the new farming minister took recently, and of course that was just so infuriating. We are where we are with inheritance tax. Well, and we just have to accept it and move forward. Well, that's the sort of language you apply to acts of God or the actions of foreign governments, not a policy that your own government has implemented and could quite as easily reverse.
And I guess it partly comes back to the perceived role of farming and food within the economy. And ultimately, there are a whole range of stakeholders that the government wants to please and appease, and probably farmers are not the highest up that list in terms of a natural labour constituency. And we're talking here, I don't think we've sort of talked about what has actually happened, and I'm just going to mention it because, again, we ran a story just after the budget which was pushed out partly by the NFU, which just said budget rule change will reduce pressure for some farming families. So there is change, albeit it's not a very large one. The government announced that any unused £1 million allowance for agricultural property relief and business property relief will be transferable between spouses and civil partners to bring it in line with the treatment of the nil rate band and residents nil rate band. And NFU President Tom Bradshaw said, "It's good to see the government accepts that its original proposals were flawed. This change goes nowhere near far enough to remove the devastating impact of the policy on farming communities." So that's essentially what we've been saying. I think it is worth reflecting again that the government has a massive black hole, and I've been pretty shocked by a lot of the press attention towards the budget over the course of the last few days since it. A lot of it has seemed to me, frankly, pretty misogynistic. The reality is that COVID was a huge investment in people in this country, but it cost an awful lot of money, and it's going to take probably decades to pay that back. Not least, we've still got Brexit as well, which has had, according to the OBR, the Office for Budgetary Responsibility, between 4 and 8% impact on on GDP, on growth, on the economy overall in this country. And, the size of these things added together really can't be overstated, much as, much of the press would like to see the government sorting it out in the space of a fortnight. And so I think we need to look to the future. And, we've heard this a few times on the podcast recently, much as farmers are currently largely reliant on public subsidy in one form or another, although there are an increasing number of smaller regenerative farmers that are managing to farm without that support, there is, increasingly an assumption that we need to work on the basis that there will be no public support for food production in the future. The trouble is that, of course, we have been reliant on that for so long that there does need to be a decent transition, and that transition needs to be managed by everybody, by government, by the farmers themselves, by all of the organizations within the farming community kind of helping and supporting that. But at the same time, there is such a strong case for public funding of public goods. And within that, I probably include nutrition as well, nutrition improvements, which of course is slightly confusing and slightly woolly, because at that point we are talking about food as a public good, but actually I think it's the nutrition element, the public health element within food production and improvements therein, though that's the public good aspect of this, that needs to be properly funded. And it clearly isn't even accepting the idea that maybe farming ought to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. There's a need for transitional payment. There's a need to recognize everything else that farming does apart from food. And frankly, we're not seeing that from this government. And maybe with that thought, Joe, you could come back, but also take us into talking about the sustainable farming incentive.
Yeah, and just final point on SFI, and again, it's something we covered before. Sorry, on IHT, ffinlo. Yes, of course, there's a huge black hole, but NFU and other organisations have put together alternatives,
Indeed.
or alternative ways of levying IHT, which would raise more revenue. So it's not a revenue issue. This to me really is an ideological issue. But yes, moving into SFI. Yeah, look, we've now heard again in the last week or so from the Environment Secretary that we cannot expect any news on SFI until perhaps the middle of 2026. So that kind of original closing of SFI back in March 25, we're now looking at summer 26 for any further news on that. And we really have no idea what form that scheme will come back in. And I agree with everything you just said, Ffinlo, that essentially if we're going to transition to this more nature-friendly kind of farming system, we need those transitional payments in order to achieve that. Now, that is obviously fundamentally at odds with, you recently had Professor Sir Dieter Helm on a podcast talking about how he believes essentially that supporting farmers to transition to more sustainable methods is the wrong approach, and actually they should essentially be taxed into compliance. Now, I fundamentally disagree with that. But of course, yes, everything you just said around the current economic structures and our trade patterns and everything else militates against the fact that farmers can sort of essentially produce a higher quality, more sustainable product for ever less money. And that's where, of course, at the minute, 50% of all English farmers are currently outside of any sort of support scheme, with the old EU payments now completely removed. So yes, where are we at the minute? Well, some lucky farmers are in a position where they are at least being helped to survive at a time of historic low commodity prices for things like cereals and milk. 50% are outside of those schemes, and that is an absolute tragedy in action, as we see. We've been talking about a cliff edge now for years. We are approaching a cliff edge as the industry. Look at the statistics. Look at the number of farm businesses now falling out of the industry. We are over that cliff edge, and government really does need to recognise that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. The thing that I'd just like some clarification on, Joe, is exactly where you've heard that message from the Secretary of State. Because what I'm looking at is a press release from the NFU from the 21st of November, which is talking about the SFI reopening in the first half of 2026, and that being sort of generally welcomed by NFU Deputy President David Exwood. Have you heard something since that?
I think it's possibly experience, long-lived experience, Ffinlo. So we were told just in this instance that we'd hear by the end of the summer. The end of the summer has now become the first half of 2026. I think if if a government these days says they'll do something within a time window, we shouldn't be expecting it to happen at the start of that window. Let's expect it to happen by June at the earliest, let's be honest. And regardless, we know there is no money to fund SFI until some 10,000 mid-tier agreements start to expire at the end of 2026. So the reality is that just on the pure economics, it's going to be 2027 until any money starts coming in for farms of any considerable amount through a new SFI scheme. So I think it's just important to manage expectations. The Oxford Farming Conference is not going to see the announcement of the new SFI scheme and then opening the next week in 2026. It's going to be second half and into 27.
Well, there we go. Let's be pessimistic and then be pleased if we're proved wrong. I think that's a good place to be. And of course, we should also just reiterate that this, of course, is England that we're talking about when we're looking at Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Actually, there are schemes that all farmers can be signed up to, which are essentially based on whole farms, whole farm approaches, and area payments of one kind or another. So there is still money going to farmers across the rest of the UK. It's England in particular that we're talking about here, where, as you say, you've got half of farmers that are sort of out of any scheme at all. So moving on to the next subject, we have backsliding on environmental imperatives. And this is a topic really that you suggested to me last week. And in sort of looking through the various different headlines that we've got on 8point9.com, we need to sort of look at the global level as well as at the national level. And why don't we start with the global level and start by looking at COP30, because the headline that we had was that COP30 ends without action on food systems, heightening risks. And this was a story coming out of IPES Food. It was talking about, despite being billed as the COP of truth, COP30 has ended without recognizing industrial food systems as a major source of climate pollution. And I use the word industrial there because it's really key in terms of the conversation that I think we need to have, and also in terms of the rest of this article. Now, IPES Food warns that the final agreement on COP30 fails to address the 1/3 of global warming emissions from food systems or the escalating damages caused by fossil fuel dependent industrial agriculture, risking deeper climate and hunger crises. And the particular concerns, there are three specific concerns that they have. The first is that industrial food systems were omitted entirely, despite being responsible for at least 1/3 of global emissions, 40% of petrochemical use, and 15% of fossil fuel consumption. Deforestation commitments were diluted with no reference to commodity-driven deforestation or indeed industrial agriculture. And corporate influencers, it says corporate influence unchecked, with over 300 industrial agricultural lobbyists shaping discussions and promoting what the think tanks call false solutions. Now, let's start with that last one, because I don't personally want to see these agricultural lobbyists excluded from the room. I think it's critically important that all stakeholders are at these conferences. At the same time, if you have an awful lot of people representing industrial agriculture, then that needs to be factored in and balanced in some way, so that you hear Indigenous voices and citizen voices, just as loudly. And I'm not quite sure how that balancing happens, but it's not outside of the wit of man, is it, to achieve that. But I do think it's important that we hear from all stakeholders, because ultimately it's those industrial providers, along with government regulation and change on the ground, economic change, it's them that need to be delivering this.
Well, absolutely. And but here's kind of the problem that we're locked into this destructive cycle, aren't we, Finlay? An economic system which still doesn't place a genuine value on natural capital, which everyone is looking for ever cheaper food. And it's those industrial farming systems which are continuing to provide for that need. So again, I kind of come back to sort of mentioning Professor Sir Dieter Helm's recent essay on agriculture. Yes, he was talking about UK agriculture, but he could have been talking about global agriculture in terms of his solution being the polluter pays principle, and essentially taxing what he would consider to be industrial agriculture until it complied with what we would like it to be. But that's too blunt an instrument. We need to be having these whole system pan-societal conversations around what a good food system looks like. And of course, that good food system really can't operate in isolation from what does a good economy look like that works for everyone. Now, this is all starting to sound quite socialist, of course. And it's, I would
Not necessarily. I mean, I think there are different views, aren't there? I mean, you can have a right wing or a left wing vision of what a good economy looks like, and it will be different. But sorry, carry on.
Well, no, and it comes into, I believe, another story you want to pick up, and maybe this is the time to do it, Finlo, around is it Chris Smage's new book?
Sure.
Around again, what does a good food system look like? And I guess the problem that we're finding with the COP conferences, and I think with every COP that goes by, we're kind of increasingly disillusioned with the outcomes of that, whether it's around oil, whether it's around agriculture. I guess there is this backsliding. There's this sense that we are backsliding away from the urgency that seemed to have been felt at sort of earlier COPs. As we see a shift towards more populist governments around the world, as we see the actual economic impact of some of these sustainable transitions taking hold in the short term, all being conflated for other issues that are going on within the economy, and it's being blamed on those transitional kind of arrangements. And we are starting to see this backsliding. So obviously, at COP in Brazil, we didn't see the US, we didn't see China taking a stand either. The US just wasn't represented at all. India wasn't represented, I don't believe. So it's setting terrible messages. And of course, then what are consumers supposed to think? What's the corporate world supposed to think about our commitment to these issues? So no, it is a danger. And again, we can talk about how that trickles down to UK policy in short order. But I think that more fundamental question around how agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and of course, when we talk about, a third of global greenhouse emissions come from food production, we're not talking about farming in its isolation. We're also talking about the wider food system, including things like processing and transport. But of course, farming is an important part of that. Yes, we need to talk about that bigger, and you and I talk about this frequently, Finlo, and I know you're a passionate sort of advocate for the subject. That bigger issue around, yes, nutrition, the health system, and everything, public well-being, engagement with nature. But we can't just expect farmers to suddenly become sort of sustainable champions in isolation within an economic system which does not value sustainability.
Which, of course, links us back to that previous conversation. It's what does that transition look like? What are we aiming for? And I think the emphasis that IPES Food is now putting on fossil fuels is exactly the right emphasis, because the emissions lens has driven all kinds of perversities, I think, in relation to so-called sustainable agriculture, where we've seen intensification, where there's been more bang per buck in terms of food produced, calories produced, linked to emissions, but that's often been at the expense of more agroecological approaches, at the expense of water systems and other sort of natural cycles. And so I think putting the emphasis, as IPES Food does, as the Global Alliance for the Future of Food now does as well, on fossil fuels specifically, and how to eradicate or at least greatly reduce fossil fuels in our food system, that's the place that it should be. And let's mention Chris Smage here, although I want to come on to him in a bit more detail later. But if people haven't yet heard our podcast with Chris, or indeed read the article that's on the website, his new book, Finding Lights in a Dark Age, is absolutely fascinating. It's a wonderful read, talking about the way in which post-transition society might look and what those sort of key challenges are. And one of the key challenges that he talks about is energy futures. And it's, when we are unable to use fossil fuels to the extent that we are because of the impact that it is having, when we are unable to use or to sort of supplement, replace that fossil fuel energy load with renewables, what happens, and how does society look after we've sort of moved away from the cheap, abundant energy that we all take for granted today. Anyway, sort of coming back, I think you were talking about the political climate within which this COP exists in, and you talked about the rising populism and political threats from Trump and the pushback against net zero, and I think those are all really important. And it is this aspect where it's been relatively easy to make commitments. It's been relatively easy to sort of talk in terms of trying to limit global warming to 1 degree or 1.5 degree. The Paris Agreement, much as Christiana Figueres did a huge amount of work to get that commitment, within the Paris Treaty. At that time, what was that, a decade or more ago, we are now getting into this situation where actually implementing, implementing changes through policy in order to address climate change, and of course the nature crisis more broadly, is having an impact on people at a time when economies are smaller, at a time when the cost of living is through the roof for an awful lot of people. And so of course there's pushback, and it requires a lot of bravery from government. And as we've discussed many times, that bravery simply doesn't exist at the moment. So it's quite a depressing kind of global picture that we're talking about. Again, most of the pressure coming in terms of the nature crisis and climate change from those poorer countries that are most immediately at risk from the impact of those things. Although, of course, as we've discussed, we are suffering the impacts of climate change already with water, with floods, with droughts, with a whole range of different things, our ability to be food resilient, etc. But it's those countries that are poorer, that are in need of money to fund that transition. They're the ones pushing for it at the same time as those developed and richer nations are stepping back, which is deeply depressing. Should we move from the global context back to the UK, Joe?
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, this kind of then there's this sense, isn't there, to a lot of people's surprise, I think, under again a sort of a left of centre Labour government, that there seems to be this impression that they are stepping back as well from commitments to nature and the environment. And a lot of people would consider, for example, Boris Johnson's time in government to actually have been almost a golden age for commitments to nature. Now, look, I'm again, as eternally I am, more cynical about that. I think that there was an awful lot of smoke and mirrors involved with previous governments, which again, it's easy to make commitments when you're not going to have to deliver them. Now, of course, again, our current government has essentially run into many of those those timescales where they now have to start delivering on some of the commitments made 5 years ago, for example. But what they are seeming to do is to be prioritizing economic growth, much of which they seem to be attaching to essentially, building housing and infrastructure. Now, that is running into all sorts of issues in terms of previous legislation and previous protections around nature. And so what we're seeing is organisations such as the Wildlife Trusts and RSPB, for example, coming out and really launching some quite stinging attacks on the government's current plans for things such as the BNG market and those kind of nature markets that are still in very much a nascent stage. And I think there are genuine concerns. And again, we've talked about them before, ffinlo, in terms of how they impact on essentially the green economy that was supposed to be coming to the benefit of farmers, as to how that's going to pan out. And if nothing else, it's the level of uncertainty which therefore is being heaped on people like housing developers and other development companies around, well, actually, do we need to worry about these things? Because they've kind of got it into their heads that they did need to factor that into their decision making. And all of a sudden, there's this level of uncertainty coming in again, which I'm not certain is even welcome to those developers. I think they just want to know what it is they're supposed to do. I think the chopping and changing at a policy level, almost on a monthly basis now, is debilitating for all of us.
Yeah, and we're getting that across the board in so many different policy areas, aren't we? And certainly we're seeing that with nature. That's been the big concern, that there's this chopping and changing, and the change in rhetoric where the government will say, of course we're committed to nature, we're doing this, we're doing that, but then there are other things sort of happening in the background which creates that lack of consistency. And when you started talking about Boris Johnson, or indeed before that, about the idea that a left-wing government, you'd expect a greater commitment to nature, the thing I wrote down on my pad was rhetoric versus action. And that really is ultimately where we've got to be judging, is not on the things that they say, but actually the things that they do. And so I guess what I want to do here is to sort of talk about the imperative again, because we hear this from Rachel Reeves. We've heard this from other people within government, that a particular bat or a particular butterfly is somehow an impediment to development. And it's not about a particular bat or a particular butterfly. It's about nature more broadly. It's about, masses of species being lost on a sort of annual basis. And so I'm just going to pick up on this story that we had. Natural Resources Wales identifies 3,000 species in peril. Taking simple, cost-effective measures now can build resilience and help secure the future of Wales's most vulnerable species, Natural Resources Wales said, as a new study from the environment body reveals that almost 3,000 vulnerable species exist in 5 locations or fewer across Wales. And they're talking about a range here, sort of from the larger, more iconic species to ones that most people probably haven't ever heard of, from the turtle dove and belted beauty moth, then down to the Arctic alpine pea mussel, woolly feather moss, and eyed chestnut wrinkle lichen. And so, or lichen, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. I think it's sort of changed a little bit over my lifetime. And so there's a whole range of different species. And so, as I say, it's not about 1 or 2 species. It's about the mass of nature overall. And here we got a quote from Mary Lewis, the head of Natural Resource Management Policy at NRW, who says this report makes it clear that we aren't simply at risk of seeing species going extinct in Wales. It's already happening. As a country, we need to take the threat seriously. And so within that context, we've just there set out yet again the idea that nature is in crisis. We need to do something to address that crisis. And then we come to this story that came out a week or so before the recent budget, which really, I think, was the RSPB and the Wildlife Trusts just trying to put a shot across the Chancellor's bows. But they basically are warning that the UK government's blinkered build, baby, build agenda is creating a perfect storm of threats to nature, and that this is at odds with the public's ambition for protecting wildlife and habitat, which is at an all-time high. And again, they're talking about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, and they're talking about BNG. And the Planning and Infrastructure Bill has been pushed through. Lots of people have been calling for amendments, quite technical amendments, but which would have recreated those safeguards, made sure those safeguards for nature were in place, which haven't been accepted by the government. There is a bit of confusion, I think, around biodiversity net gain at the moment. And you'll be familiar, Joe, with my thought that if biodiversity net gain is accelerated, once we start building the houses, which of course are currently being planned, they're within the planning system rather than necessarily being physically built, then at that point, that market could be enormously valuable for a lot of farmers across England. We're hearing here from RSPB and Wildlife Trusts that there are rumours of imminent changes to BNG, but specifically they're talking about exempting small development sites. Small development site, I've been searching for a definition. I think it's around a dozen homes. That's kind of what we're talking about. Most of the developments that we're going to be seeing are going to be larger than that. Obviously, I don't want to see that rowing back on BNG at all, but at the same time, let's put these things into some sort of context.
Although I guess opinions on that might differ, Finn. I heard in an interview on Radio 4, I think, earlier this week, that at the minute, some 90% of developments are actually in that smaller, something like a half-hectare category. So actually, those smaller sites, it kind of sounds innocuous, but and I'm not sure whether you're correct or the speaker on Radio 4 was correct, Finlo, but potentially that sounds like a lot of the development we're talking about actually would be impacted by this.
Well, it's a question of how big is the thing that we're talking about half of, isn't it? So half of a small amount of development being in these small sites is not necessarily a vast amount. When we're talking about 1.5 million homes being built, then they're not all going to be built in small sites, much as at the moment the planning system is still largely coping because we're not seeing enough of these really much larger developments from a housing perspective, and so we are still seeing quite a bit of infill. I mean, as I say, from my perspective, I would like to see BNG associated with absolutely everything it currently is, and I think it should stay that way. But in relation to BNG as well, Environment Bank recently led the first dedicated BNG summit for nationally significant infrastructure projects, that's NSIPs, And so this was 300 different attendees, different stakeholders coming together, exploring how major energy, transport, water and waste infrastructure projects can prepare for delivering a minimum of 10% biodiversity net gain. Toby Perkins, the MP for Chesterfield and chair of the Environment Audit Committee, said BNG is an innovative and world-leading policy with the potential to support the twin goals of nature restoration and economic growth. Thus, he says, nice use of archaic language, always a pleasure. Thus, I am delighted that the government is rightly forging ahead with applying BNG to nationally significant infrastructure projects next year, and that the industry and business are gathered here today to ensure that this important policy is implemented effectively. And so it works for both developers and the environment. And so at the same time as the potential threat to those small developments, at least the government is forging ahead when it comes to those much larger developments. Exactly what that means, exactly how that's going to be rolled out, time will tell. But and again, it is that sort of, well, either commit to the policy or don't. But at the same time, if we're looking at it in the round, I'd rather they were focusing on the big projects, even if one or two of the smaller projects do fall by the wayside.
Can you imagine how many billions it would add if you to do HS2 plus BNG these days, though, Finlo? I mean, it'd be we could have paid to do two moon programs rather than just one.
Don't get me onto HS2, Joe. I mean, I've never seen.
Well,
like
you can't get anybody
idea.
onto HS2 for now. That's the problem.
That's
it's
the
not
problem.
been bloody built yet.
Indeed.
But no, yes, of course, big infrastructure things should fall under this. If a farmer has to do BNG for an extra bay on a grain store, then so should massive infrastructure projects. Of course, Labour's concern is that this is adding delay and cost to construction and development at the time when they're leaning on that to be the absolute, essentially the benchmark by which they may or may not get re-elected in 3 years' time. So it's understandable that Steve Reed, ex-DEFRA Secretary of State, has gone from extolling the virtues of newts to wanting to slab concrete down on top of them in his baby build hat. It's understandable, but again, it's that gap between rhetoric and reality that is so concerning. And again, let's look at the figures. So, as you know, the Allerton Project is associated with the environmental farmers groups, and they've estimated that in 2025 there's some 113 million pounds worth in the market, the total value of BNG, nutrient neutrality, soil carbon and woodland carbon in England in 2025, 113 million pounds, 100 million of which is BNG and nutrient neutrality. These are not big numbers, and they are not going to be transformative for certainly, the rural economy. And you have to wonder to what extent, again, we've talked about before, BNG, 90% of it is delivered on site, around your housing development, around your industrial units. Again, are we actually delivering what we need to be delivering if we are going to be improving the state of nature, given all of the targets, many of which fall within this parliament? And I would put a question mark around that. It's difficult to both build your cake and eat your cake of, essentially of nature recovery, right? That is a difficult circle to square.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got challenges at a global level, challenges at a national level. We do have some world-leading legislation here, both in terms of net zero and biodiversity net gain. And let's hope to goodness that the government does something to make sure that, that legislation is maintained and that we continue delivering what can only be thought of as some world-leading change. But we're a way to go away from that yet. Joe, let's take a break. And we're back, and we're going to talk about soil carbon, Joe.
Yeah, so this is this is one of the great hopes, isn't it, globally for essentially reversing the warming of the climate. Can farmers and land managers lock up atmospheric carbon in their soils whilst improving, farm profitability and fertility through things like regenerative agriculture ultimately? And of course, what the potential is in many markets now, including the UK, is to then trade that carbon either to sell it as an offset or to have it inset within your supply chain, or just to retain it on the balance sheets in order to potentially help your own farm business become carbon neutral. And it's just an interesting element of this natural capital market, which again, sort of going back to my earlier comments, according to the Environmental Farmers Group in the UK, in 2025 was worth around £4 million. So we're still talking about the very low foothills of where this market might go. But of course, unlike nutrient neutrality, unlike biodiversity net gain, everyone has soil. And so there is the potential there for essentially every farm in the UK to be getting on to, or for a very large number of farms in the UK to be utilising soil carbon as an additional income stream whilst looking to benefit the environment. And actually at the Allerton Project this autumn, we did our first full farm carbon baseline ourselves with a firm called Ecometric. And we think that it's an important data set for us to have going forward. Now, we're not planning to trade carbon in the near future, but I think it's really important to have that data. As with everything, baseline data really, really key to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd be interested to hear about that, that baseline modeling that you're doing at GWCT in just a moment, because, of course, we're starting this conversation partly in reaction to a headline on 8.9, which was EFG Partners, Environmental Farmers Group, partners with Regenerate Outcomes and Ecometric, following a comprehensive review of the soil carbon market. Environmental Farmers Group has announced agreements with Regenerate Outcomes and Ecometric, two leading UK soil carbon program providers. The review, which examines the integrity, methodology and market readiness of multiple providers, conducted that these two companies offer the clearest, most robust farmer-aligned programs. And Regenerate Outcomes Director Tom Dillon added that now is the right time for British farmers to secure soil carbon baselining so that the environmental benefits they're delivering on farm can be recognised and rewarded now and in the future. And one of the things that Tom always talks about, and I think also that Johnny Balfour recently talked about on a podcast that we covered with him, is the idea that you need to make sure as a farmer, as a farm, that you are essentially assessing your own need for credits, because there is a likelihood that you're going to need to demonstrate to the market in the future that you have offset your own carbon, within the farm. Assess that before you then work out what's left and sell the carbon that's associated with that. And just to sort of mention that podcast, it's Natural Capital for Scottish Farmers. And although it has Scottish in the title, an awful lot of what we talked about, I think, is relevant across the UK, and therefore definitely worth listening to, even if you're not in Scotland. That was with Johnny Balfour and with David Robertson, who's the Director of Investment and Business Development at Scottish Woodlands Limited, who's also been on the podcast in the past in our Natural Capital Filling the Funding Gap series, and also by Bruce Wilson, who's Head of Policy and Advocacy at Scottish Wildlife Trust. So between those two and Johnny, we had some really knowledgeable people talking through the natural capital market there. Tell me about your own sort of what you were looking for at the GWCT in terms of that soil carbon baselining approach.
So for those who don't know, the Allerton Project is a research and demonstration farm. We're a working commercial farm, primarily arable, but we also have a full-time team of research scientists, primarily actually soil scientists. So we have quite a lot of data on a lot of our soils. It's a sort of silt clay, heavy land site, but ultimately this was a commercial decision. We do an awful lot of soil analysis for research purposes, but this data set that we've collected through a sort of a full farm carbon baseline really is there to future-proof us. It's there for exactly the reasons you mentioned, Finlo. Perhaps carbon trading will become an integral part of agricultural supply chains in the coming years. Now, again, we're not looking to trade that carbon away in the short term, because we think it's important that farmers retain the flexibility to utilize it for their own purposes, exactly to demonstrate carbon reduction pathways, and to demonstrate the ability to sell into potentially premium markets in the future. So we're not expecting the data to be potentially that illuminating from a research point of view, because even at the granular detail that such data is collected, it's probably not fine enough to help us overly with our research work, which requires really, really fine data. But certainly we would say that, look, the measure and remeasure approach is, for my money, it's got to be the better way to go forward than essentially the measure and model approach, which is essentially estimating the impact on soil carbon that management techniques will have, whereas sort of measuring it and then measuring it again in a period of time seems to be more robust. Now, look, there's no getting around the fact that soil is an incredibly dynamic and incredibly unpredictable resource. And just the fact of climate change is going to have a huge impact on our soils, regardless of management techniques. So it's still, for me, it's still a look. People often describe it, the carbon trading landscape, as the Wild West, right? Because there's no regulated code like there is in woodland carbon or peatland carbon. It's very much left up to the private market. Now, we can't keep hiding behind that, I guess I would say, in terms of refusing to engage with that market, because otherwise we'll never get anywhere. But absolutely, we do need to be mindful of the fact that farmers need to be very certain what it is they are doing with their carbon before they do it. And it is something you certainly don't want to be looking, I wouldn't say, as a short-term cash injection to make up for a lack of SFI or BPS. We need to be taking a much more clear-eyed look at the potential of soil carbon markets for us going forwards.
And so this was an assessment, a baseline assessment based on actual carbon, and coming back to measure again actual carbon rather than modeling.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
absolutely. And this was something that Johnny talked about. It was why he was particularly interested in these two, Johnny specifically was interested in regenerate outcomes. And of course, you've gone with ecometric, but these are companies that look at the actual carbon that's there and then come back and measure again, rather than just working on a modeling basis and then making assumptions. And also, I think with regenerate outcomes, it was the idea that you maintain the ownership of that credit, and then regenerate outcomes are aggregating your credits along with other credits in order to then sell them in a bundle which is acceptable to the market. It needs to be of a certain size in order to get market entry, and it's only when that's sold that you then relinquish that unit and get the money for it, rather than selling these things on a model basis. So that was really important. And just while we're talking about, can I just ask you about the depth? Do you happen to know the depth that ecometric were going down to?
Yeah, so we're going down to 30 centimeters, and again, it's an area of live debate whether it should be 30 or 60 or 90 centimeters. Of course, the majority of certainly the majority of the carbon will be found in that top 30 centimeters, but the cost, of course, increases significantly the deeper down you go, and so there's no right or wrong answer at the minute in this area. And again, just to sort of briefly say, things like the Woodland Carbon Code, of course, that is based on a modelling approach, and yet it is easier to model, based on the sort of evidence available, the data available, things like above ground biomass, of course, than it is to model what's going on invisibly under the ground. So again, again, so that measuring and remeasuring approach to soil carbon probably is going to be your most robust way of measuring it, whichever depth you end up measuring down to. And again, the jury, I guess, is still open on that one.
And that measuring and remeasuring is actually important within the Woodland Carbon Code as well. And I'll come on to that in just a second. But I just want to mention a conversation I had with David Wright, who's the CEO of Ecometric, probably a year, 18 months or so ago now, talking about the soil depths and how you make a judgment as to the depth that you need to go down to. And I guess, really it's about when you get to the bedrock and how far down the farming is having an impact. And so if you've got relatively shallow rooting stuff and it's been shallow rooting for quite a long time, then 30 centimeters is fine. But as soon as you start having sort of those deeper furrowing swards, if you like, those rooting depths that are going down lower, then it is worth going down to 60 centimeters or even a meter, depending on the soil type. But those are judgments that get taken based on a particular field or a particular farm and the way that farm has been managed. Because as you say, certainly, in recent times, that cycling over the first 30 centimeters has been predominant. But in those sort of richer soils where you've got much deeper rooting plants, the carbon is being drawn down, the biomass is getting down there, the necromass is sort of building, etc. That cycling is taking place at much lower depths. So it's it's important to sort of, think of those on an individual field, individual, sometimes, individual corner of a field, let alone individual field and individual farm basis. Just coming on to the Woodland Carbon Code, because again, within that podcast that I was talking about, that Natural Capitals for Scottish Farmers, we talked again about the Woodland Carbon Code, and there was a debate about the idea of modelling versus actual, which was sort of coming from Johnny's comments around soil. And although there was a certain degree of pushback from David Robinson from Scottish Woodlands, I don't think we quite made the point as clearly as we might. And so we had a comment that came through from LinkedIn from Pat Snowden following, he'd just listened to the podcast. He's the head of economics and woodland carbon code at Scottish Forestry. He said, interesting podcast, great format. One clarification about the Woodland Carbon Code in response to a comment that Johnny made. Although estimates of future carbon removals, otherwise known as pending issuance units or PIUs, are based on models. When the trees are initially planted, verified units, woodland carbon units, can only be generated following site checks that the trees have grown and delivered the carbon intended. So obviously, as you were alluding to, we have a lot of history of measuring rings and carbon accrual within trees, but so much of it depends on land type and weather and all those other things. And so although there is a modeled assumption about what you're going to get from a particular pending issuance unit and a certain size of forest or woodland, that is checked at various different stages before those credits are actually finally sold. And while we're on corrections or comments from the audience, I think I should also mention this is going back a couple of podcasts, well, several podcasts now, and I'm not quite sure which one it was in, but I made a massive faux pas and suggested that beech trees had only been in Britain for 200 or 300 years. I completely misspoke. It wasn't beech trees that I was thinking of at all, or possibly it was the horse chestnuts or the sycamore. I'm not quite sure, but beech trees, to be clear, have been here since somewhere between 4 and 8,000 BC. So something like, let's say for the sake of
Is it
argument,
4 or 8, Finlay? 4 or 8? I'm going to push you now.
we don't know, but let's work on the assumption that it's around 6,000 years at least. And when we come to a horse chestnut, they've only been here since 1616 specifically. Apparently, they were introduced from the Balkans, I'm told, and sycamores at some point came over in the 15th or 16th century. So there was probably what I was thinking about. I've always worked on the assumption that sycamores are relatively newcomers. So even finding out they've been here since the 15th and 16th centuries is extending what I thought. So always really happy to have these corrections. So if either of us are saying something, and it's usually me that's a bit daft, please write in and let me know.
I've got some random Afghan northwest frontier zone of Pakistan pine in my garden. I don't know where it's come from, but it's bloody huge. But yeah, I mean, let's find out when that arrived in the UK, shall we?
Yeah. Should we do that another time? Absolutely. We'll find out for the next podcast. Now, the last one that I wanted to talk about in this sort of section of looking at ecology is that land should be integrated with trees and food, says the Forest Market Report. I don't want to spend loads of time on this, but at the same time, it's just worth mentioning that, we've talked about the integration of food systems and agroforestry, forestry more broadly, that we don't have enough land to have loads of forests there, loads of food there, and spare it all off. We need to integrate this as much as possible. And there is a degree to which, the industries, both food industry, farming industry, and the forestry industry have kind of wanted to get on and do their own thing for a long time. But there is an increasing recognition that these things have to be delivered together. So this is farmers and foresters may not be in the same boat, but they're in the same storm, said forestry experts at the launch of a new industry report. Communication and collaboration on land use were key as forestry and farming faced common uncertainties, including government policy, product prices, and cost inflation, said the UK Forest Market Report 2025, produced by BSW Group's Till Hill Forestry and Goldcrest Land and Forestry Group. So they bring out a report annually, and this is the latest one. Xander Mahoney, who we also interviewed a long time ago now on 8.9, I must get him back on sometime, head of forestry investment for Till Hill Forestry, said forestry and farming have often been slightly uncomfortable bedfellows in the rural space. Today, there are perhaps more pressing shared challenges than the relatively minor skirmishes between us, and we should be working together more effectively and more frequently. So that's that. I guess that's a bit of good news to end this section on.
Yeah, and just briefly on that, I mean, and again, sort of going back to Chris Smager's book, he makes the point that, from an output point of view, sort of more regenerative systems with trees based in them, they can be higher productivity than the systems that we currently recognize as kind of standard today. And of course they can be. But I guess then it all comes down to, and it's the efficiency with which you can do that, essentially the price at which you can get the food out the door. And that's where, things like agroforestry can potentially fall down for all the benefits, of course, that they do bring to ecosystems, to resilience. We have to tackle that fundamental, the economics of food production, which will stop us from adopting things like more trees in landscapes, or will certainly slow that adoption down until things become so bad from a climate point of view that it will become, absolutely an imperative to do so. We've got to ease that transition.
And I guess that brings us into the final topic of the day, which we're just going to spend a few moments on, which is around food and global security again. And this specifically was a piece of a news item on the site. 1.7 billion people suffer lower crop yields due to land degradation. And this, again, it comes back to whether you have a short-term policy or a medium to long-term policy. And yeah, just as you were saying there, agroforestry in the system may create a less of an efficient system in the short term, but in the medium term, it's going to mean that your system is more resilient. So it's finding ways of supporting economic systems, models, measures that allow people, farmers, communities to plan in term, and governments indeed, to plan in terms of that sort of medium and long-term need. So this kind of brings me back a bit to COP30, I suppose. But the start of this news item says approximately 1.7 billion people live in areas where crop yields are falling because of human-induced land degradation, a pervasive and silent crisis that's undermining agricultural productivity and threatening ecosystem health worldwide. And the report delivers a clear message that land degradation is not just an environmental issue, it impacts agricultural productivity, rural livelihoods, and food security, and indeed, as we've discussed in the past, security more broadly. And, this just feels to me so pertinent at the moment that we are still putting so much of a push onto things like fertilizers rather than looking at agroecology. And it strikes me that there is still, clearly there is an urgent need for agroecological solutions. And yet the strongest, and this is perhaps where some of those NGOs were coming from in terms of COP30, about the power and might of advocacy of those industrial food producers at COP30. Yeah, let's have them in the room, but let's accept the fact that, they need to change as much as anybody else. And here we have really strong advocacy still coming for solutions, false solutions, as I would think of them, that benefit Western companies. You think of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, still such a big push for fertilizers, prioritizing food and calorie production over, medium-term resilience. The solutions that we need to look for are smaller scale, they're community-led, they're lower input, and they're high knowledge. And those things don't make money for big American companies. And of course, although I'm sure the Bill Gates Foundation would strenuously deny that they have links to big business, there is no doubt that where the advocacy of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation goes, big business follows, and big business does incredibly well out of.
So I have a book recommendation for people, and it's something I'm currently rereading, actually, which doesn't happen very often. It's called Dirt, The Erosion of Civilization by David Montgomery. And it's a fascinating and I think really important read that demonstrates the importance of taking a long-term view of soil management, because from Montgomery's view is that the rise and fall of civilizations through human history can be put down to poor soil management. Now, for me, it's a compelling argument, and you can see it around the world today. 1.7 billion people currently living in areas of degraded land. Through history, we have, as a society, we have exhausted our land and we've moved on to fresh land. However, modern humanity, we now have an unparalleled ability to degrade our agricultural land, either through over-cultivation, over-application of inputs, simplified rotations, or even over irrigation, which can lead to salinization of land. And there's a fantastic graph which, if you go on something like Our World in Data, you can see that essentially the global land take used for something like wheat production has barely increased in the last 100 years as the amount of food that we're producing has massively increased along with population. But what that graph doesn't take into account is all the land abandoned in the last 100 years because of soil degradation. As we move on to fresh land, and of course we are very much running out of fresh land to move on to. And at some point, our Earth's carrying capacity is going to sort of outpace our ability to extract ever more from that land. Soil as a healthy ecosystem is the foundation of our civilization, and we absolutely have to take a longer term view on that resource. And it is something which still baffles me that soil is such an underappreciated topic, and there's a compared to so many other issues, it's still not considered sexy. It's still not considered a research priority or a protection priority. We have in the UK legally binding targets on air quality, water quality, biodiversity, species, and all the rest of it, but still nothing on soil. Because genuinely, I think people still do not appreciate how important good soil management is to everything that we expect, to everything that we do as a society.
Yeah, absolutely. Should DEFRA be renamed the Department of Soil Discuss? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's such a fundamentally important thing, and I don't know the exact statistic, and so I may well get this wrong, but it's around about this, that within the last 30 years or so, the amount of desert in the world has increased by about a third. It may even be more than that, but it's a vast amount, and the thing is that just as that desert has been created over the last 30 years, it is so quick to be able to restore so much of that land to fertility if you graze ruminants in particular in the right way and reintroduce systems. And I remember speaking to Adele Jones, who was until recently at the Sustainable Food Trust. She'd been at COP20. I forget which COP it was out in the UAE, and she'd been at a project, which was in the desert, surrounded by desert, but their fields outside, the project offices were full of grass, were entirely fertile because, they've been reclaimed, I think, just over the sort of 5 or 7 year preceding period because of the use of livestock within there. So it's possible. It's just that there isn't enough understanding at policy level, and there aren't the drivers in place. Still, the economic drivers are pushing the desertification. They are pushing these false solutions like fertilizers and fossil fuels, when these are exactly the things that we need to get away from. And I guess there's a degree to which this is bringing us on. You've kept trying to push me towards Chris Smage all the way through the podcast, and I'm really pleased, because the more mentions Chris's book gets, the better, because I think it really is something that people should
If I mention my book, it
hold
seems
of.
self-serving.
Yeah, well, tell me which is your book?
We'll come back to that one, Finlay.
No, give it a plug at some point, definitely. But anyway, Chris's new book, Finding Lights in a Dark Age, I think is really pertinent, really important. It's so easy to sort of look at the future in terms of doom and gloom, and what Chris does is to say, well, look, let's take it as read, really, that there's going to be a collapse. But what does the world look like afterwards? And this, to an extent, is the position that I've been in for a long time, where I'm sort of thinking that all of the work that we're doing here, all of the things that we're trying to understand, it's about trying to understand what systems could be, in order that when we fall into the hole, we can climb out of it faster and build back better. And so what Chris is doing here is trying to sort of say, well, look, there are some good things that will come out of this transition that we're going to go through, or collapse, if you prefer, in order that society is doing better. And what he says is that, within dark ages in the past, when the Romans left Britain, because they were such closed societies, the DNA record of the Romans is almost non-existent, because they were such closed societies. When they went away and took away the pressure that they had on food systems and other systems while they were here, there was a resurgence of life, at least in theory, back there during the Dark Age, where people just were better off. They were less likely to be killed, and they were more likely to be able to grow food in peace. And so those things that we've talked about there, in terms of the wider community, the wider global community, those sub-Saharan Africa, those things about keeping people in place, trying to address the security issues, the potential migrant crisis, by making sure that food systems function so that people can stay where they've been born, which ultimately most people want to be able to do. That stuff about smaller scale production, community-led production and decision making, low input, high knowledge. These are all things that Chris is seeing in the future for Britain, in the same way that we need to see it now in the futures of sub-Saharan Africa and India and elsewhere.
We're just so, look, and I agree as a conceptual idea, and it goes back to an agroecological look at essentially the food system, isn't it? And again, it's not just looking at farming in isolation, it's looking at a whole food system and how people are connected to the land. And look, it increasingly it feels like the right solution to me, but the reality is that short of a total societal collapse, we are so far away from that as a system. So we have to take some of the most important elements of what Chris is talking about in that context and others are talking about, and we have to try and integrate it into the food system that we've got now. The supermarkets aren't going anywhere, the big processors aren't going anywhere, but they have to appreciate that there is strength and there is longer term greater profitability in a more decentralized system, which is less brittle and less fragile in the face of sudden shocks than essentially where we currently are. So we can all continue to hopefully turn a fair profit from the food system, but we have to accept that people like Chris do have very valid points and very valid concerns and do offer solutions to how we can reduce the risk in our food system.
Yeah, and they have the vision to be able to articulate it. And I think that's the thing that I really appreciate about the work that Chris has done, that he spent an awful lot of time thinking about this stuff. And where he comes to is really not dissimilar at all from where I'm expecting humanity to be. The only question is exactly how long it takes to get there. He's talking in terms of 100 years. I worry it might be slightly closer than that. But the question is, what is that collapse that we're going to go through before we get to that point? And I think at the crux, and it's easy to romanticize, what's going on. What Chris has done, I think, is to take a more forensic view of the way that society might change. And he's recognizing the good and the bad at the same time as saying, that there are these things that he values, that he thinks will be really positive for society. A lot of it's about changes in power structures. And as I said earlier on, it's about energy and climate. Those are the key drivers that he sees. And I'm not going to sort of, re-rehearse a lot of the conversation with Chris. People can go back and listen to that podcast where Chris and I had a long conversation about his book, which I found really fascinating. But it's about power centers. It's about the way in which in the future, London, will be trying to cling on to power, but its ability to deliver its strategies, its influence across the country is likely to be lessened to quite a large extent. And so you're likely to see new sort of power structures, whether that's Bristol or, smaller towns like Frome, where Chris lives, these smaller centres taking decisions for themselves. There'll be certain things they have to take from the centre, but then, these communities will take decisions and have their own forms of governments as well. And I think the analogy that I used in the podcast with Chris was, if you kind of think of a big pond, then you've got a fountain that's not really properly functioning anymore, but it's bubbling under the surface, delivering sort of ripples going out. But then you've got these constant sort of stones of different sizes being dropped in. And if you look at all this together, you've got the constant ripples from that fountain that's still almost functioning underneath the water. But you've got these other larger sets of ripples, all of which are interacting with each other, which then come back to people being able to produce food themselves, land access being much more shared, going back maybe to sort of tithe type systems, that we used to have in history. So society starting to look perhaps in 100 years much more like it looked 200 or 300 years back in the past. And elements of modern life still existing, some renewable energy and electricity still being there, some systems still functioning, but a lot of the others having sort of, died a certain death. And for me, although that sounds depressing, and happy Christmas, everyone, although it sounds depressing, I kind of, I don't want to romanticize it, but if I was living in that system, in that situation at the moment, I might feel that I actually had more personal and family resilience than I currently feel.
Then, you strike me as the sort of chap who's got a basement full of
Baked beans.
disaster preparation supplies. Yeah, I've got a well-stocked armory and a lot of baked beans somewhere.
I feel like I've gone through quite a lot of it in the last year.
Yeah. But no, look, resilience. We've got to have a more resilient food system, more resilient economy, and look, whatever the exact details of that will look like, we'll have to get to that place eventually. We are just so far from it at the minute, and we are not even seriously thinking about these things. So we need to be having these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, that might feel like a slightly depressing note to end on. So let's remind ourselves of one or two of the good things that we've talked about over the course of the program. I think that there is this sort of increasing awareness of the need to address the nature crisis. There is an increasing awareness that farming is part of the solution and can really deliver, and that those agroecological systems are the systems that have greater resilience. But it's at the moment, a lot of that is at the grassroots level, isn't it? We need more of that understanding in 2026 coming from policymakers, coming from government, and more funding for the transition. Anything positive that you can think of to bring us to the end of the program, Joe?
No, I agree. Look, we sustainable farming has so many of the solutions to the problems that society faces, and I do believe that the future is bright. I agree, and I'm increasingly sort of saying this, that we just clearly need to make a better job as an industry of shouting about those solutions that we can bring, and we need to engage with consumers. We need to engage with voters. They are the people who will eventually bring the pressure to bear on governments and the supply chain to support farmers to deliver on all these things that we know that they can do. We have shovel-ready solutions ready to go. Places like the Allerton Project can demonstrate how you can have nature and you can have food production side by side. We just need to get buy-in for that across a wider landscape.
Yeah, and just to remind us of that story that we touched on, a short while ago, land should be integrated with trees and food, says Forest Market Report. Really positive to hear that from the forestry industry. Great, of course, that we're having things like the agroecology show now, where there's recognition from increasing numbers of farmers about the importance of integrating trees for a whole range of different reasons. So again, that's positive movement in the right direction. And so from my perspective, I think I'll leave it there on that sort of positive thought. And I will say happy Christmas. It's in terms of when the podcast goes out, it's in a couple of days. I'm looking forward to it. Certainly, I'm going to be enjoying a bit of a break and a rest over the Christmas period. That's it. Thank you, Joe, so much for joining me throughout this year on Wheat from the Chaff. I look forward to talking again come January. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us, and share our links. Farmgate is the world's highest ranking food security podcast, and Farmgate Leaders and Martin's Farm and a whole host of other programs are available if you just scroll back in your podcast feed. If you get fed up with your family, want to go and walk the dog and listen to something interesting, then there are loads of programs there to get your teeth into, get your ears into. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, the Nature Friendly Farming Network, Friarsmore Livestock Health, Agrolo, and individual donors. I've been Finlo Costain. Bye for now.
And I've been Joe Stanley. Merry Christmas.